This thesis explores the application of hip-hop cultural products and processes as critical and generative logics for the redevelopment and planning of cities, most notably concerning the socioeconomic repair of communities of color. My positioning of this investigation into urban space derives from my youth in Philadelphia and adulthood in New York City, the two largest cities in the northeastern USA. 8 years of education in inner-city settings accelerated my interest and participation in hip-hop music, technology, and culture, along with deciding to study architecture. This embodied experience of the tensions between educational spaces of discipline and in disinvested spaces of invention positions me to investigate novel approaches to reconstructing the spatial and socioeconomic urban fabric and advocating for developing culturally relevant strategies and tactics of generating posterity where it has been obscured by the imbalanced development and governance of cities. The socioeconomic peril of inner-city minority neighborhoods can accurately be measured by the failure, insensitivity, and encoded racism of 20th century urban planning, urban renewal, and modernist architecture imposed on communities unfairly painted as slums. The resultant lives and socioeconomic potentials of the population, largely dictated by preconceived systemic factors outside of their control. One of the few redeeming qualities of the adverse dwelling conditions emerging from the historical context of urban renewal is how they became the backdrop and catalyst for the birth of the hip-hop cultural movement. Hip-hop has gained worldwide recognition as a bona fide culture through subversion of authority, spatio-sonic manipulation, reappropriation, amplification of identity, and communal synthesis. Despite its maturation as a movement in almost every sense, it's lacking in its spatial and architectural manifestation, in contrast to the many Eurocentric cultural and artistic movements cataloged in architectural canon and education. This spatial yearning of hip-hop culture, coupled with the increasingly dilapidated and disinvested built environments from which it emerged, represents fertile ground for deploying hip-hop as a spatial paradigm. This thesis aims to address concerns of disinvested and gentrifying communities, minority architects, planners, and developers, and the participants of hip-hop culture. The desired outcomes of this thesis are an architecture to curb the negative effects of gentrification, to reclaim, retain, or reimagine urban black spaces, to propagate structures of advantage while deconstructing structures of disadvantage, boosting the relevance of the built environment to the communities that it's had the most severe effects on, and a call to action of the hip-hop community as agents of change. My primary research question is, how might the tools, techniques, and processes of hip-hop provoke new engagements with and reformulate the spatial typologies and existing urban conditions central to Black identity as evidenced in hip-hop culture? And most notably from my underlying questions, how can spatial manifestations of hip-hop culture realize socioeconomic potentials? This thesis seeks to operate within the notion of the hood, envisioned as a residual artifact of the mid-20th century propagation of modern architecture and racial bias in urban planning and urban renewal practices. This thesis situates New York City as the #1 highest dollar value recipient of federal urban renewal funds, with a collective displacement of nearly 30,000 families in the post-World War II era. Hip-hop's most incisive artists continue to articulate the utopian dream of modernism while exposing exploitation that has fueled the creation of capitalist utopias of consumption. This series of images are looking at hip-hop's four primary modes of cultural production: verbal, sonic, visual, and physical. But spatial production goes missing, especially architecture, most notably in how hip-hop is forced to reclaim and reappropriate the existing conditions in which it was birthed. To superimpose New York City's public housing stock over red-lined neighborhoods paints a clear picture of whom and which neighborhoods bore the burden of the racist political residue of the post-war housing environment. Segregation, political containment, and white flight coincided to cause systemic disinvestment and a decreased tax base that left communities of color in a downward spiral of lack of resources and needed infrastructures. These R&D exercises delve deeper into the cultural products and processes of hip-hop culture and situate them in terms of relevant scholars of the built environment. Lyrical exercise seeks to utilize hip-hop lyrics as a primary source of post-occupancy reporting on the urban conditions experienced by many minority communities and the original and ongoing practitioners of hip-hop culture. Analyzing lyrics that reference specific places or spatial typologies allows for the extracting of scales and sites to engage. This method generated one specific condition and one typology to spatially intervene in. Don't Sweat the Technique aims to catalog and analyze the artifacts, tools, and techniques of the DJing pillar of hip-hop culture in order to generate an operational language for implementing architecture as the emerging fifth pillar of hip-hop. Hip-hop's tools and technologies being born out of the adaptation and reappropriation of everyday objects begins to situate their relevance to using those techniques to generate spatial imagination and potentials in the built environment. Diagrams illustrate several common techniques and tools of hip-hop DJs through a lens of architectural representation, the turntable, mixer, and sampler, and seeks to catalog their gestural and auditory effects. Manifesto sampling explores ways to generate an evaluative framework by looking at existing contemporary manifestos and literature relevant to hip-hop, architecture, and Black identity in the built environment. The following criterion, drawn from these sources, frames how new programs are implemented across the sites, categorizes and evaluates design responses for the effects yielded for the constituents and how it might resonate with the audiences of this thesis in the context of minority urban experience. Manifesting thought essays. These outcomes catalog the spatial, urban, and socioeconomic implications of design prototyping across the sites and scales of the thesis and respond to the manifestos. The presiding design methodology seeks to emulate the process of remix and sampling by kit bashing original and open-sourced ready-made 3D models. Adaptive remixed use uses hip-hop's techniques and lyrics as a reconstructive prompt for the socioeconomic fabric and public space in the Marcy projects in Brooklyn, New York. On the anti-carceral corner, the site is reconfigured to enact a form of restorative justice and reverse increasingly permeating aspects of surveillance and criminalization in minority neighborhoods. This tabular matrix situates the contexts, relevant hip-hop techniques, samples, lyrics, and theoretical texts that inform the prototypes, as well as which manifestations they speak to. Each project and these research inputs is visually and textually indexed as a thought essay.
Hey yo, y'all can't stand right here. In his right hand was your man's worst nightmare. Loud enough to burst his right eardrum close range. The game is not only dangerous, but it's most strange. I sell rhymes like dimes, the one who mostly keep cash but brag about the broker time. Joker rhymes like the is you just happy to see me trick. Classical slapstick, rappers need chapstick. A lot of them sound like they in a talent show, so I give them something to remember like the Alamo. Tally ho, a hot joker like Space Game. Came back from 5 years lane and stayed the same. Electromagnetic field, it blocks all logic. Spock and G-Shock's a biological clock. When I hit it, slid it to the shitter, thought I killed a goose. Her power use was pure Brita water, filter juice. Keep a pen like a fiend, keep a pipe with him. Gentleman who lent a pen to a friend who write with him. Never seen this shit again, but he's still my dunny. The only thing that come between us is krill and money. I sell rhymes like dimes.
Shame is a prison, you know. Yeah? Well, discretion is a fortress. You're staring, you're looking too closely. There's so much about me that I hide that careful eyes will recognize. If you look closely, you'll notice that the pattern on this soft broadcloth shirt is made of working man's blood and praying folks' tears. If you look closer, you'll notice that this pattern resembles tenement row houses, project high-rises, cell block tiers, discontinued stretches of elevated train tracks, slave ship gullies, acres of tombstone. If you look closer, you'll notice that this fabric has been carefully blended with a advanced new age polymer to make the fabric lightweight, weatherproof, and durable. All this to give some sort of posture and dignity to a broken body that is a host for scars.